In this video, we will be looking at the character of Bob Cratchit in A Christmas Carol, as well as how to answer exam questions on Bob and the Cratchit family, so make sure you keep watching all the way to the end. If you want to be notified about more videos like this one, please subscribe. So, who is Bob Cratchit? He is Scrooge's lowly clerk in A Christmas Carol, who struggles to get by on a terrible wage Scrooge pays him. Despite being constantly mistreated, Bob must work in order to provide for his family, Mrs. Cratchit and his 4 children, Martha, Belinda, Peter and Tim, otherwise known as Tiny Tim. Let's look at this quote, shall we? Scrooge had a very small fire, but his clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle. Here, Bob Cratchit, or the clerk as he is referred to, is sitting in the office where he works. His fire is almost non-existent, while Scrooge's fire burns brightly. Cratchit needs coal to light his fire, but he knows that if he were to ask Scrooge, he would likely be fired, so he resorts to trying to warm himself up using the flame of a candle. So, how is Bob Cratchit presented in this quote? To answer this, you first need to decide on a method. My students use PETAL paragraphs, which stands for point, evidence, technique, analyse or analysis, and link. If you use PEE or PWAC or any other paragraph framework, that's fine too. Okay, now you know what method you're using. The next thing to do is zoom in on the quote. Remember, in the exam, you won't have the text in front of you. At best, you'll have an extract. So it would make sense to memorise smaller sections of the quote. Here, what stands out is that Bob Cratchit isn't immediately introduced by name, but rather as his clerk. We also notice that his fire is much smaller than Scrooge's, and that Bob is wearing a white comforter and trying to warm himself by a candle. Now we've highlighted those quotes, let's see what technique the writer uses and analyse the quote. His clerk. This is a possessive pronoun and suggests that Bob Cratchit is Scrooge's property, not a person. The fact Dickens refers to him by the noun clerk and not his name throughout this quote also highlights Cratchit's insignificance. Bob Cratchit's fire is described using the comparative adjective much smaller. It is a comparative adjective because it describes Cratchit's fire by comparing it to Scrooge's. The significance of the fire is that it shows how little of anything Bob Cratchit actually has. It could also foreshadow the struggles Bob has later on in the novella. Finally, we see Bob wrapped in a white comforter and trying to gain heat off a candle. The use of the noun candle highlights how terrified Bob is of Scrooge, because it shows he would rather attempt to gain futile warmth by candlelight than ask Scrooge to share the coal in his office. Notice again how I've zoomed in, identified the technique, and explained why that technique is significant. There are dozens of different techniques that the writer could use: repetition, alliteration, hyperbole. But if you're struggling, just stick to verbs, adverbs, adjectives and nouns until you feel completely comfortable. Once we've become familiar with identifying the technique and explaining why it's being used, we need to focus on context. Context is extremely important. In order for you to pass your literature GCSE, you will have to include at least some context. So what is context? Context is what's happening at the time and how it relates to what you are writing about. So, an example of this would be in 2020, Microsoft Teams saw a 60% increase in use of its services, which sounds great for Microsoft Teams. But now let's put it into context. In 2020, we also had a thing called the coronavirus. So the increase in online interaction had to increase because we were in lockdown. This use of context explains to the reader why there was a significant spike in user activity for Microsoft Teams by providing a fact about the time period. So, let's have a little look at some context with regards to A Christmas Carol. In 1834, just under 10 years before A Christmas Carol was published, the Poor Law was introduced, which basically taxed the rich to provide the poor with some relief. Only the rich, like Scrooge, were not happy. They considered the poor to be lazy, so amendments came in where the unemployed could only receive financial assistance if they entered a workhouse. Workhouses were terrible places. People often worked 14-hour days for just enough money to survive. The conditions were extremely poor. So, Bob Cratchit, although having a job, was paid extremely poorly by Scrooge. Because of the class divide at the time between rich and poor, Scrooge would have considered himself above Bob Cratchit and refused to acknowledge Bob as another human being. So, now you know about your context, let's try and put it all together in a paragraph. As I said, I'll be using the PETAL formula, but it's only a formula. As long as you get all the information into your paragraph, it doesn't matter what formula you use. My point will be, Bob Cratchit is presented as a commodity rather than a person in stave 1 of A Christmas Carol. My evidence is, we see this in the quote, his clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. Remember, all evidence is the quote you've picked to use. Now it's time to zoom in and identify the technique and explain what the quote means. If you're struggling to fill out your analysis, think about the reaction the reader would have to this particular quote and why the writer wanted to evoke that reaction from the reader. For my technique, I would zoom in on his clerk and identify that it is a possessive pronoun. Remember, the word clerk is a noun, but the fact Cratchit is referred to as his clerk makes him belong to Scrooge, so it's a possessive pronoun. See how that translates into technique. Dickens' use of the possessive pronoun, his clerk, and then I move into my analysis, highlights that Cratchit is considered property of Scrooge rather than his own man. This is further highlighted by Dickens referring to Cratchit as clerk throughout the reader's introduction to the character instead of his actual name. This dehumanises Cratchit and makes the reader feel as though he is worthless, and Dickens does this to highlight the disconnect people had towards the poor at the time. During the 19th century, there was a significant class divide between the rich and the poor. Because Scrooge is wealthy, he believes himself more significant than Cratchit and doesn't consider him as an equal. Scrooge's social standing makes it acceptable in his eyes to treat Cratchit as a servant rather than a human being. I have used context of a class divide to support my answer. When answering questions on specific people within a novel, you can also glean information from how other characters talk about them. For example, Scrooge says about Cratchit, "My clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." Again, zooming in on the quote, I can spot the adjective merry, and this shows that Bob Cratchit values Christmas. The noun Bedlam refers to a famous mental institution, and Scrooge is saying here that Bob is happy despite being poor. How could I put this into a paragraph? Starting with my point, I could say Dickens uses Scrooge to help portray Bob Cratchit as somebody who likes Christmas. Now, have a go yourself. What word could you zoom in on here to show that Bob cares about Christmas? And what technique? Is it a verb, an adjective, a hint? For context, look up a traditional Victorian Christmas. Welcome back. Feeling confident? Okay, try this one for size. Pause the video now and try and answer the question by yourself. Remember, determine the point you want to make, find your quote to support it, zoom in on the quote and highlight the technique, analyse what this means, why the writer uses it and how it would make the reader feel, and finally add context. You can pause the video here. Okay, well done for having a go. Now, here's an example answer for anyone who was struggling. Again, in the PETAL paragraph format, I have started with Bob Cratchit is presented as someone who struggles financially. This is shown in the quote, for he boasted no great coat. The verb boasted highlights that Bob Cratchit couldn't brag about having a big coat because he couldn't afford one, even in the freezing cold of winter. The fact Cratchit has had to take the white comforter from his office in a desperate attempt to stay warm highlights the struggles he is having financially. Because of industrialisation, jobs once done by humans were being taken over by machines. With less jobs available, people like Cratchit were forced to work jobs for much lower wages and could not afford luxuries like coats in winter. Now you're starting to get the hang of it, let's have a look at a couple more quotes from Bob Cratchit. Look at the notes in red and see if you can complete the paragraphs. You can pause the video here. Finally, let's look at an actual GCSE exam question on the Cratchits. Read the following extract from chapter 3 of A Christmas Carol and then answer the question that follows. Starting with this extract, explore how Dickens uses the Cratchit family to show the struggles of the poor. Write about how Dickens presents the Cratchit family in this extract and how Dickens uses the Cratchit family to show the struggles of the poor in the novel as a whole. If you want to have a go at this question, I have posted the extract on my website, which is mrharkin.com. A few tips. This question is worth 30 marks, so you're looking for 5 solid paragraphs. In the exam, you will be given an extract, so write 3 paragraphs using the extract in front of you and 2 from your own knowledge of the novella. And remember what you've learned in this video so far about Bob Cratchit. In stave 1, he is referred to as the clerk, not by name. He has to wear a comforter because he can't afford a coat. And in stave 3, Bob Cratchit says, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." This shows that Bob and his family are grateful for each other and the small things that they have. Using the framework you're comfortable with, have a go at writing a paragraph, and I will provide you with a model answer to help you along. Okay, welcome back. From the extract, we can see that the Cratchits struggle financially. So my point is, the Cratchit family are presented in this extract as a family who desperately struggle to make ends meet. We see this in the quote, family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. The noun display hints at a vast array of glassware, but in reality, the Cratchits only own 2 tumblers and what looks like a broken custard cup. This shows that the Cratchit family cannot afford material things and have to make do with the small amount of things that they do own. Dickens does this to highlight the extreme poverty people suffered during the time of writing the book in order to try and evoke sympathy from the reader. At the time, there was a severe class divide within Victorian England, and Dickens is using the Cratchits to show that people considered poor in society were just normal families rather than lazy, work-shy people. Remember, the analysis part of your answer is usually the longest. If you're struggling for what to write, always remember to include what the quote means, the effect on the reader, and what the writer wanted to achieve. You'll be working with an extract on a 30-mark question, so do 3 paragraphs from the extract and 2 from your memory. And finally, context is king. In order to pass your GCSE, you must include at least some context. Remember, the extract for this question is on mrharkin.com and I will post a link in the description. If this video helped you, please do comment and let me know. Don't forget to subscribe and please hit that like button. Thanks for watching and see you all next time.